I'm so excited that we're having an opportunity to sit down together in this podcast and really talk about a report that we're releasing that we've been published. Thankfully, this is really fun. It's an exciting time around protective orders in Texas. So I'm Heather. I'm the CEO at Texas Advocacy Project, and I'm excited to be here. And I'm here with my colleagues.
I'm Brahma Blake. I'm the Chief Legal Officer at Texas Advocacy Project, and I'm also really excited to talk about this report.
And I'm Amanda Elkanik-Oder, and I'm the Chief Advocacy and Education Officer at Texas Advocacy Project.
So before we get too deep into the actual report, let's kind of paint a picture of what it is that we're talking about. I know the three of us wait for the Honoring Victims report to come out every year, and that's a product of Texas Council on Family Violence, one of our partners. And when we open it, we kind of have like an inhale because we're always so concerned that somebody that intersected with Texas Advocacy Project made it on that report. And it's really hard when that happens. And then sadly, this year, 3 people did. And we know that that is one of the biggest reasons why we need to keep doing the work that we're doing and try to increase our resources so that we can provide greater services and more efficiently to the people who are accessing us so well. But when they get to us and they do need a protective order, let's talk a little bit about what that can look like. Bronwyn, can you share with me about that?
Yeah, a protective order is a resource for victims of all different types of abuse: family violence, dating violence, sexual assault, and stalking. And as you guys know, it's been the primary tool around the country to keep survivors safe for about 4 decades. And in Texas, we have a really great statutory scheme to provide comprehensive resources. If you're not as familiar with protective orders, you might think of it as a stay-away order. In some places like California, they call it a restraining order. So I think most people have heard of that concept of a stay-away order, a restraining order. And in Texas, though, it's called a protective order. We actually have a restraining order in Texas. It's something else. But it's a great tool, and they're free for survivors to get. There's all different things we've done in the law to try to make them more accessible. And not to give too much away, but one of the things we've done in our law to make them more accessible is to say in the Texas Family Code that our local county and district attorneys are responsible for helping survivors apply for them.
Yeah. I think it's really important to be able to explain that in that way. I also found things that you've taught me over the years that I really like about the way we do in the state of Texas is we kind of stack it. We allow for a magistrate's order of emergency protection, and that protects the address. So it gives somebody breathing room and space to go home after there has been an arrest and the perpetrator is still being kept away from them, and they can kind of decide, am I safe enough? And then if they do want to pursue a protective order, we have a temporary ex parte, which gives us a little bit more room before they can go to court. Because explain a little bit about how you have to prove that there is danger abounds and that you do need this legal remedy.
Yeah, I love what you're saying, because when the laws work like they're supposed to, all of those tools can go together. They don't have to, but they can go together and keep survivors safe. And the way it's meant to work when you're applying for that final protective order is you'll have a hearing, and you're meant to show in that hearing that the violence has occurred. So for family violence, you need to show that family violence has occurred. If it's sexual assault, you need to show the sexual assault has occurred. And the standard of proof in this kind of case, it's different than a criminal case where we all know, beyond a reasonable doubt. The standard of proof in these kinds of cases is by a preponderance of the evidence. So the judge needs to determine they're more sure that this violence has occurred than unsure. It's a much lower standard, and it's meant to be easier to get. Because we're not saying that somebody's liberty is in jeopardy, they're going to go to jail in a criminal case. It's just saying that you have to stay away from someone and not hurt them anymore. So because it's, we're not asking that much of someone, it's a lower standard of proof. And we used to have to show a second thing, that the violence has occurred and is likely to occur again. And that's another example of Texas improving our law. Pretty recently, we removed what we called a 2-prong test, the second prong, just to make them more accessible. Everything we're doing in our law is trying to make these tools accessible to the survivors that need them.
Absolutely. And I think our elected officials are doing the best that they can right now. And thankfully, when we go talk to them about a victim's actual real life experience, they let us come through the door and they really ask the right questions. I think it's also interesting when you said this is about somebody's liberty. I think we kind of get it confused if we're watching TV all the time, this difference between civil and criminal, right? Like the pum, 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 pum.
Right.
And you're going to, think about that TV show. And then people say, well, I don't want to press charges or whatnot. But the truth is, on the criminal side, it is the state versus the perpetrator. On the civil side, it is the victim against the perpetrator. So one is protecting the actual victim and the other is protecting the entire population of the state. So that's really important there too.
That's a good distinction to make.
Yeah. Amanda, share with me when we are speaking to a client in the beginning, we've already established that our laws are pretty good here in Texas.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, they are not enforced as well as we would like them to be across the gamut. And that has a lot to do with resources too.
Yeah.
But talk to me about at that time when a person is being victimized and they are thinking about a protective order or just thinking in general about what their rights are. You share a little bit about that and maybe some safety planning?
Sure. So it depends on level of education for a lot of people on how many resources they have, how much access they have within their community, what community that they're living in. We have a lot of domestic violence shelters across Texas, but advocates are a really great place to start. They can safety plan with survivors. They can get them connected with local resources. They can help them navigate their criminal and civil legal justice system in that community. And so the domestic violence programs, rape crisis centers, human trafficking agencies are really great community-based organizations to help survivors. It can be really difficult to navigate any legal system. And a survivor is going to be the expert in what is safest for them and what they feel comfortable in doing in that moment. Let me take you on a ride for a moment. Let's say a survivor contacts law enforcement and law enforcement responds to a scene. It is the crime victim's rights in Texas for that law enforcement officer on the scene to give information about available resources, including protective orders. The law enforcement officer on the scene might also, if they have enough evidence, arrest that abuser. And that's when that magistrate's order of emergency protection might be in effect for that survivor as well. And that law enforcement officer will give that information to the survivor. But it is the crime victim's right for that law enforcement officer to give them the information and the resources that are available in their community and statewide. So Texas Advocacy Project, for example, is listed in all of those different resource packets because we are statewide and we do serve all 254 counties. And there is not enough legal aid resources across the state. And so we want to make sure that survivors know we can serve you no matter what area of Texas that you're in. And they can contact our legal line number. They can fill out an application online 24 hours a day. And I think that is the first step for survivors in learning and trying to understand what are their rights, what can they do when they're ready, how can they navigate that system safely? Because for some survivors, it might feel real overwhelming, and so they might not want to move forward.
Talk to me a little bit about safety planning. When we first started working together, you did a lot of advanced safety planning trainings, and you really trained me quite a bit on this. And unfortunately, in my private life, I've had to use some of the tools and techniques that you've shared with me. But what sticks with me a lot is that safety planning is very fluid. It is not a one and done, and it is not the same exact for every person. There are some things like having a safe word, letting the people that are your support system know that you might need them. But share with me a little bit about that.
Sure. Safety planning is individual to each person. When I started in this field 20 years ago and I worked in a domestic violence shelter, a survivor would come in and we would give them a 9-page packet. Do you remember Mad Libs?
Oh, gosh.
It was like Mad Libs.
Oh, no.
It was like fill in the blank.
Bless them.
And so what it did was it would touch on key points. Where is your documentation, your kids' shot records, your identification, your passports, any medication? Where are those? Could you locate them quickly? Could you get them into a safe bag and set off to the side? We have an incredible program at Texas Advocacy Project, as you know, called Handbags for Hope, which was created on that premise of a safe go bag for many survivors. That's a lifeline for them, right? And so that's one of the tools right? A safe bag. It is much more complex than that. And so safety planning is individual with the survivor. What have they tried before? What's worked? What hasn't worked? What access to community resources do they have? Have they intersected with other systems before? Have they gone to their local food bank, or do they have public assistance or benefits in any way? Is there a local domestic violence shelter? In some parts of Texas, there are deserts for
Absolutely.
shelters. So it might take 2 hours to drive to the nearest shelter. And that's if that shelter has space, right? So what are the backup options? Do we have community resources that can help with safe housing and temporary housing in hotels? Do they have family members or friends that maybe the abuser doesn't know where they live? Or they might have a really great security system, right? And so those are questions that we will ask survivors and really help navigate those conversations to get them thinking about their safety planning in a different way. What's really important to understand is that safety planning has to happen beforehand. It can't happen in the moment when somebody's in crisis. So we really want to plan for it. We do this in everything, right? If I go out of the country, if I travel to another city, I'm like, okay, what's the crime rates in that city? Possibly because of the work that we do. Maybe that's why I'm looking at crime rates. Do I have access to healthcare? Do I need to go to a local hospital? Where is that located? I'm doing fire drills with my kids. Like, what's our fire safety plan in our home? So we're already planning.
Well, we need muscle memory. That's the hard part, right? And when you're talking about safety planning, how do you create muscle memory? Most people don't go through their lives saying, "Oh, I'm living with this person that I love, that I fell in love with, and then I became the frog in the slow boil," which is like the most scary way to describe that. But we don't plan on how do we get away from the person that we love or who has said they love us.
Mm-hmm.
So, how do you get somebody into that mindset to do that?
Yeah. And I think it really is just about when the survivor's ready. They've seen and navigated the complex realities that they've lived in, and they notice the slight change in behavior or an escalation in violence. They see those types of things. But sometimes when we're living in those realities, it might be harder to see when it's escalating, when there have been things like strangulation or sexual assault or things like that. Those are key indicators of risk and lethality.
Interesting that you said that. This morning, I was actually on a call with a survivor, a former client. And by the way, as an aside, you might hear me call somebody a victim or a survivor. The reason I do that kind of interchangeably, it really depends on where they are in our service provision. We have had former clients that have said, we were a victim when we came to you and a survivor when we left you. And of course, that just, fills our heart and gives us the energy to keep getting up and doing this over and over again. But that's kind of why I'm doing it. But I was on this call with her this morning, and this is where you get the slow burn statement. I'm absolutely repeating her words. She said it's like a frog, right? That whole analogy that the water is of regular temperature and then it creeps up and the frog doesn't jump out. And she was talking about, for her, it escalated. Yes, she knew it was bad, but she would have to navigate conversations, the complexities. If I leave, I'm going to be living in a car with my children. She actually told me she went to another state and said, I need to get out. And they sent her back to Texas because they said that the laws in Texas are going to better support you than the laws we have here. So you got to go back to him and kind of like fake it till you make it until you can get the access to the legal systems that you so deserve. So she had to make that decision. And then she said that that particular attorney told her that, one of the considerations are what if he got custody? And if they were in this other state, that would have been more likely than here. But these are all the things that are floating around in a person's mind when they're in the deepest crisis they've ever been in. And their need to protect often means that they might put themselves in harm's way unavoidably for a while until that moment hits them when they say, oh, this is never going to change. And no matter how hard it is to get out, I got to get out. So when that happens and they reach out to us at Texas Advocacy Project, and we're a legal services provision, yes, we do safety planning and we do have social workers on staff. How do you help them to kind of flip that switch in their mind?
Well, if somebody calls Texas Advocacy Project looking for legal options, one of the first things, as you guys know, we're going to ask them is, what does justice mean to you? What is most important for you? Because once we can ascertain someone's goals, maybe it's just to stay safe. Maybe their primary concern is about children. Maybe, they're trying to figure out shelter. It depends on what's important to them. Then we can advise them about your options, the reasons you may choose different ones to best effectuate your goals. And it's that empowerment-based advocacy that we're always striving for. We want the survivor to be in the lead. We want to give them the information and confidence they need to make the decision. And then, even in those first phone calls, nobody's going to leave without knowing the very next thing they need to do and have what they need in place to do that.
So share with me on this protective order report that we just had published, how some of the information that you garnered there is going to help us to navigate the individual justice systems. I know you two have explained it to me very well, and because I'm not the attorney, I appreciate all the background I can get. But some of the things that we learned is there's what the statute says, there's what the law says, and that should be even across the state. And then within each area, every county, there are what we call local rules, and it might be you'll have to file with this clerk on this day, or there's only hearings on these days, or there might be a judge on what we call circuit riding, meaning they're sharing different states. All of those things kind of play in it. But then there's the kind of like the super secret pinky swear rules that layer on top. And again, it's probably back to resource allocation or back to whether or not there's been trainings on the way laws have been adjusted throughout the years. Tell me about what that kind of looks like a little bit.
Sure. Well, you shared a story of speaking to somebody who was trying to navigate different laws in different states, right? And at least in Texas, we know that we have the same laws throughout the state. However, we also know, like you just said, they are enforced differently in different areas. So if we're going to best advise people, we have to have that knowledge to know, okay, in the 254 counties in Texas, can I tell someone, okay, you want to stay safe. This is what a protective order is. Here is where you could go to get one. They're going to get very different responses if they go to the local prosecutor's office in one county versus another. And we could talk about the reasons why. We could talk about the impact of that. But, when the rubber meets the road, we have to know where they can expect easy access and where they won't. And at our agency, we want to be able to deploy quickly and help the people that need it most. So we want to be able to advise people, and we need to determine where to send our resources. So I think there's two main reasons for that.
I agree. Amanda, share with me some of the things that you found most shocking. Again, you've been on both sides of this. We've worked here at Texas Advocacy Project, and Brown, obviously being an attorney, has done the legal services side of it. And I just, keep repeating everything that you all have taught me through the years. But you've been both on the shelter side and on this side. Tell me what was most shocking or interesting points that you found from the perspective of an advocate and somebody who's going to help a victim become a survivor as they're navigating the systems.
Yeah, I think it's really important to note that this is an updated resource. So I was also on the opposite side of this in 2013 when the first report came out, and there was such a huge gap between these two reports. We really found it necessary to understand from the perspective of what our attorneys need to know so we can deploy those resources really quickly and survivors have access, but then also so that survivors know what to expect in those counties. From an advocate's perspective, one of the really interesting things that we found is that the main barrier is geography. Where you're located at in Texas is dependent on if you'll have access to a protective order or not. And that's really hard to hear. And from an advocate's perspective, it's important that we know that too. I don't want to re-traumatize a survivor and ask them to go to their local prosecutor's office to help get a protective order. And they're going to have to go in there and tell their story, which is the hardest, most traumatic things that they've ever experienced. And they're telling that to a random person, a complete stranger, that's a part of a huge system where they lose a lot of control, and to be told that they can't get help.
Yeah.
and then they call us, right? And by the time they've called our agency, they've probably told this story to multiple people and multiple systems. And that's really frustrating and overwhelming. And so part of this study, and one of the really interesting things that we found, and one of the most important things that we found, is where you're located and that geographic access.
Yeah. So we've shared with our audience out there in the internets of the world the picture of what this is, but tactically, let's explain it. So my understanding is, again, back in 2013, we did this, and we did it in conjunction with some partners. And then internally, we have our spring break law clerks update this information so that we can use it. And now we have published it. But that looks like 254 counties, we got about 170 responses. How did we ask the questions? So can you give a little bit, Bronwyn, I know that you were a lead on this.
Absolutely. Even though we had that great report from 2013, we knew internally that we were going to need to keep that updated because of what we discussed before. How can we be giving clients the most up-to-date information if we're not continuously asking these questions? So for a decade, we did that every year, and we got different answers over time. So that's how we came to decide, hey, it's time maybe to bring this out to everyone's attention again. And to do that, we again started with our spring break law clerk. So Texas, like many places, participates in a pro bono spring break where law students, instead of going to Cancun, can come volunteer their time at a nonprofit.
And aren't they just the sweetest?
It's the best. We get
Cancun,
hundreds of free hours. Hundreds of free hours every year. So we had them call the contacts that we've been calling year after year, and they got a lot of responses that way. But because we were ready to publish, we couldn't just leave it at that. We looked up, joined the Texas Association of Counties and made sure we had the right contact information. And we wrote letters to the elected officials saying, hey, we've done this survey. Here are the responses. Do you want to check them? Someone in your office gave us these answers. Or we said, we've reached out and we haven't heard back. Do you want to have somebody call us back? So we sent a number of letters and emails to those contacts, and we're able to get a significant increase in responses that way. So I feel that everyone who wanted to respond did.
Yeah.
And I think that there's a lesson to be learned from the places that didn't respond.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Perhaps we need some more trainings.
Yeah.
Maybe we need to open up lines of communication a little bit differently.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, training is such an important part of this journey. Laws have changed. Elected officials change, right? Every time we have a new cycle of an elected official, we see that their own internal policies, their staff will change over. And so there is an increased need for continuing education. We said at the beginning of this podcast, I'm going to keep saying it, there is a very big difference between policy and practice.
Absolutely.
And so we really want to ensure that when somebody is coming into office or when somebody is intersecting with a survivor, no matter where that's at, that they know what they're able to do and what the law says.
So what we really achieved here is some very significant data that can help to drive policy and help to drive these conversations and find out where the deserts are, as you mentioned earlier, and how we can help them. Between the two of you, I'm sure that you know some of this data kind of off the top of your head. Give me some of that.
Yeah, I'll let you start.
Sure. I think that I mentioned that we had some non-responses, and one of the things we did was research all the counties, but especially those counties, to see, well, was there any information on the internet? Were they trying to point people to a phone number or a website and a place to get help? And there's definitely some counties where they flat out tell you online, we're not going to help you. You can try to get help from Texas Advocacy Project or somewhere else. And then there's places where there's no information online at all. So I think right away, that's one of the percentages that I'd like to see change in the next decade, is to have all counties have information online about where they can go for help.
Yeah.
Even if they want to send people to Texas Advocacy Project, that's great. Put that online, because, if I'm a lawyer that's been working in this field for 20 years and I'm having trouble figuring out who's in charge of this in that county, That's a problem
Yeah.
right away. But there's encouraging things we found as well. We've got a greater percentage of respondents say that they will actively help enforce their protective orders.
Okay.
So what that means is not only will they help someone get the order, but if the order is violated, they will keep the abuser accountable. They will bring the abuser back into court in front of a judge and say, Your Honor, this person violated the order and perhaps they need to be punished for that. And let's figure out what's the appropriate punishment. So I always say at Texas Advocacy Project, an order isn't worth anything if you're not going to enforce it. And we always help enforce our orders. But in 2013, we didn't have as high a response rate, and that number's improved. I think that's encouraging.
That's very encouraging.
Yeah. One of the things that stood out to me in this report is the counties where we saw really great responses also have really strong collaboration. So multidisciplinary teams. So not just the prosecutor's office, but you had the entire community who really sees this as an issue. It is a public health issue. It is a crisis in these communities. And we're seeing that in Honoring Texas Victims report that you mentioned at the beginning of this podcast. We're seeing this in the crime victim rates that we get from the Department of Public Safety. We looked at the crime victim rates this year over the past 5 years, and we've seen that there's been a steady increase. 33% or 32%, I'm sorry, 32% increase in family violence incidents. And there's also been an increase in the amount of people who've applied for protective orders. That went up 11%.
Okay.
But if we see that there's an increase in 30% in family violence, but only an increase in 11% for people applying for protective orders, we've got a big gap there. And how do we get those survivors protected?
Yeah. That's why we need more civil legal attorneys out there to help the general population because, think about it. Well, for those of you that are just now kind of tuning in to the work of Texas Advocacy Project, this is what we do. We provide free civil legal services to victims of domestic and dating violence, sexual assault, human trafficking, child abuse, stalking, all those atrocities that might need a legal remedy to get you long-term safety. And of course, we want the person who is coming to us and looking for that long-term safety to be able to drive what that looks like for them. So at Texas Advocacy Project, we're only as good as the laws that are on the books because that's all we have the ability to access. But I love, and I'm so appreciative that we have a team that is able to really dig deep into this evidence and say, okay, where and how can we help? Remind me, Bronwyn, I'm not going to get this right without you, but you can file for a protective order where the abuse occurred and or where you're living. So maybe some of these little hints and tips and tricks that we've got in this report. Talk to me about how that might look.
Yeah, you in Texas used to only be able to apply for a protective order where the victim resided or where the abuser resided. And then they added that. That was another, just constantly improving these statutes. They added and said you also could apply where the abuse occurred. And the original thinking was, well, certainly you'd want to apply where you live. That's most convenient for you. However, let's say part of your safety plan is that you're now living in a location that you're trying to keep confidential.
Oh, yeah.
Well, then you might want to apply where the abuser lives because he knows where he lives and he or she lives, that's not an issue. The improvement to the law of saying you could also apply where the abuse occurred is because of the subpoena powers in the state. Let's say you all were off on a vacation in Dallas for the weekend and there's witnesses there, there's a police report there, there's medical records there. You might need to file there so that you could have the subpoena power bring it in. So, practitioners bring these ideas for improvements forward, and we've had significant improvements over the last 20 years and certainly 40 years in our protective order statutes. I'd say the number one improvement is the types of victimizations has expanded. So not only can you get a protective order for family violence, but even before 2013, we had added dating violence and sexual assault. And now more recently, you can get a protective order for stalking or human trafficking. So while we made it sure to keep the questions in this report the same as 2013 so that we could have some comparison, we added a few for those new areas of law. We wanted to see, well, now, in 2013, you couldn't get a protective order for human trafficking. Now you can. Are you helping people with those? So we did add some new questions for that.
That's great. I'm glad that we're continuing. We're always looking at the evolution of what the landscape looks like for a victim to become a survivor in the state of Texas.
Yeah.
Amanda, you look like you might have something to add. I know it.
I just want to add that one of the things that's really important and a huge improvement that we've made over the last 3 to 4 legislative sessions is also mandating training for specific populations. So it used to be optional for judges, for some law enforcement officers and prosecutors on what their continuing education would be. And from feedback from survivors and from advocates and from attorneys, and we sit on those committees as well, have said, hey, actually, it needs to be mandatory. These domestic violence cases, sexual assault cases, even human trafficking cases are going in front of every single court, right? Including trafficking court. And I think it's important to mention that. So judges need to know, what are the dynamics of abuse? What does it look like? What does it look like when it shows up in your court? And we have trainings. That's my favorite thing to do, is talk and to train and to help educate our communities so that they know, again, how to bring those policies and put them into practice in the best, most trauma-informed ways.
Well, I think it's interesting because all of these abuses are based on power and control, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that power and control, that seeps into every area of somebody's life.
Mm-hmm.
The coercive control that we're working so desperately to bring to the center of attention right now so that people can understand the motivations of why somebody who's being victimized may present in a way that someone who's never been through that type of trauma could ever imagine presenting. I was on that call again earlier today, and we were talking about kind of flipping the switch and why is it that the victim has to prove so much in order to get safe? And why do they have to go up against so many societal norms around why didn't she just leave? And what can we do about that? So I think it's really important for us to kind of invite anybody who's listening to us right now to kind of come to these conversations with such an open mind, and just to be able to understand that there are resources like Texas Advocacy Project out there. And then you touched on these task forces that we sit on. Last year we closed about 6,200 cases. And since I've been at Texas Advocacy Project since 2005, we've hovered between 4,500 and 5,500 cases annually. So extrapolate that out, and we've got the voice of hundreds upon hundreds of thousands of victims who are now survivors to bring to these conversations. I'm sitting on, as you know, the Family Violence Homicide Prevention Task Force right now, and we're looking at 3 lethality indicators. The first quarter, we really looked at stalking, and we were in that meeting and somebody said this, and it just, I can't unthink it now, but that stalking is homicide in slow motion.
Mm.
And then next, we're looking at strangulation. And Bronwyn, I've heard you say this before, that we'll have victims say to us, oh, he choked me. You're like, no, choking is when you swallow a piece of food wrong. Strangulation is somebody stopping the air from getting through your body. And I just listened to one of our kind of homework sessions on understanding the topic better. And that is a place where oftentimes it will present to law enforcement when they come in that the victim is the perpetrator, because it's the only abuse that causes such a natural instinct to fight off, because breathing is just, we breathe.
We have to.
If you don't breathe, you do whatever you must do to breathe. And so the scratches and the pushes and the this and then that might show up more on the perpetrator than on the victim. So talk to me about, actually, there was Kelsey McKay and did some trainings for law enforcement on strangulation. Give me a little bit of that background, Amanda.
Yeah, there's been a lot of evidence-based research that's come out in the last decade, which is really incredible, because I can tell you from when I started working in this movement 20 years ago, I'm sure both of y'all could think back to some of the earlier cases that y'all worked on. We didn't have the same education and information. And petechia was not a term that was just like thrown around normally, right?
But can you explain petechia, please?
I totally will.
Thank you.
I totally will. So there are indicators for strangulation, and I think what is really important and what law enforcement have to get extra training on every single year for these exact reasons, because there are more defensive wounds on an abuser, is to really look at, there's not going to be immediate bruising in most cases. In very severe cases, there may be like ligature marks. So you might see some more bruising there, but not immediately on most strangulation survivors. You might see petechia, which is the blood vessels in your eyes will burst. And so it looks like the survivor has really red eyes, right?
Which might make somebody think that they were under an influence or something of that nature, which is categorically not true in most cases. Yes.
And because they're oxygen is being cut off from their brain, they may seem a little out of it. They may not present as, very coherent, right? Because they were unconscious in most cases for a period of time. And so it's really important for us to understand the damages that strangulation has, not just on like the physical and like the neck, which can cause internal damages to the neck, but it can also cause traumatic brain injury, which can be treated with like neurofeedback and different types of therapies. But there's like brain damage that happens when oxygen is cut off in your body. And so there's long-term effects of strangulation. And so law enforcement are trained now on what to look for and things to look for. Oftentimes there's policies in some law enforcement agencies that have really taken this on. I can speak directly to Travis County Sheriff's Office because my brother-in-law works there. So I ask him all the questions. But they have internal policies. They check back in with a survivor after 24 and 48 hours because they want to take more pictures, because that's when more evidence starts to show up. They can build a better case. When we can build better cases, get better evidence, we can hold abusers accountable.
And it's really important, right, for the law enforcement, because they're the first responders, to understand their role in that.
Yeah.
And again, most law enforcement are going to try to, but not everybody's educated on it. So it's great that those trainings exist.
Yeah.
Going back to the stalking conversation, I know that we're going to work a little bit on that policy-wise this coming up legislative session. But the discussion that it is homicide in slow motion, I also think that there's a risk there because we are trained as a society to think about an incident occurring, but this is not an incident in stalking. It's a pattern of behavior. Talk to me, Bronwyn, about that pattern of behavior.
Well, that's a choice that Texas has made. You can compare stalking statutes around the country, and there's a big variance. In most states, it's a misdemeanor offense, which means it's a lesser offense punishable by less than a year. But in Texas, it's a felony.
Good.
So you could look at that and say, well, we take it very seriously. It's going to be punished as a felony. A year or more is the punishment. But I also think it's because of the way we define it. We do define it as a pattern. So more than one incident, threatening someone with serious bodily injury or death. And there's other states where they don't make you prove a pattern. So I think that's an interesting thing we might want to look at in the future. Is why is it dependent on being a pattern in Texas? That's just always how we've thought of it. But it's interesting to look at other states there.
Very much so.
One thing I think that's really interesting to bring it back to the protective order report that we did, and we asked about stalking protective orders, is there does not have to be a criminal case that coincides with the availability of this resource and getting a protective order if somebody has experienced stalking. So if a survivor has experienced stalking, which is a pattern of harassment, pretty much, right, is what we're seeing, they don't have to have criminal offenses that accompany that in order for them to receive a stalking protective order, which can feel like a barrier for some survivors if they're like, I've never called the cops. Well, do you have a stalking log? Like, do you have pictures of that abuser text messaging you 98 times in 5 minutes, or reaching out to all of your friends and family members, or creating fake social media profiles to harass you?
Or even doing things that somebody else would never see as a threat. I mean, that's part of it, right? So it's the why and the how does this make you feel that really needs to be discussed. And the first responders do need training on that. And I know that we're working on that quite a bit. Because if, I told you that my husband sent me a dozen red roses, you might think, oh, what a sweetheart. But if it's somebody who has been showing this pattern of behavior, I might know what those roses mean. And so it is very important to open up those lines of communication early. So.
Yeah. I'll speak a little bit about my personal experience, if that's okay, with stalking. Having had some lived experience with stalking in my past, it was really difficult to identify what everybody else would see as dangerous and what I thought was dangerous. So when I would come home to visit my parents, I would have flowers on my parents' gate. My parents have a lot of property and they have a gate at the bottom of their property. And you're right. A normal person would be like, oh my gosh, that's so sweet.
Yeah.
They left you flowers. But what that told me was that he knew I was home and he knew I was at my parents' house.
Exactly where you are.
And it was very scary for me. And it was little things like that. When he sent me, a page that was like 12 pages to my house that I moved to in Austin. It was like a daily diary of all of his thoughts and feelings. It's not really what the content of those letters was. It was that he knew my address and that he mailed it to me. And that's when I was like, oh my gosh, like this is really scary. And I felt really in danger. And so I think it's those little pieces and putting all of those pieces together and listening to survivors when they say, hey, these flowers on my parents' gate are scary, that we believe them when they say that.
I think that's another good place to make the distinction between the criminal law and the civil law, because in Texas, the criminal law for stalking requires that you're proving this fear using the standard of a reasonable person in the same circumstances.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really hard to get someone who's not in the same circumstances to understand what you felt in those circumstances, to show that you were being reasonable. And that's the criminal law.
Mm-hmm.
So if you can't meet that burden, that's a hard burden, you still could seek a protective order. You just want the person to stay away from you. You know, whether they get a criminal punishment or not is up to the state. But if you just want to be safe, it's great that you're still able to access this tool, and that we're meant to have that distinction. One is just for you, just to keep you safe, and you can still go get that.
Yeah.
So I think I recall in that report, right, that was 23% of the counties required there to be a criminal.
A police report.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the statute, I can let Bronwyn speak to this a little bit more about what the statute requires, and then we can go into it.
I found it on question 4.
Oh, good. I'm glad.
23%.
Teamwork makes the dream work, ladies. We're getting this done.
Yeah, I think requiring a police report, even, you know, if you say, well, 23% is a smaller percentage, that's really scary.
Yeah.
That they require you to have the police report before you can just get their help to get someone to stay away from
Nearly
you.
a quarter of the 170-ish counties that responded to us on this.
Right.
Yeah, that's terrifying. And it's not required by the Texas law.
Right.
Yeah.
So our legislature meets, they make these laws, we go testify, we bring the voice of survivors, as you said, you know, we're happy with the law the way it is. But this extra hurdle that some counties are putting in place, I think it's untenable.
Yeah.
Because there's a lot of reasons why you might not choose to pursue a criminal case.
Yeah.
And that should be your choice.
Well, at the very least, it could take 1, 2, 3, sometimes 5 years before a criminal case can come to fruition. And again, it's not that you get to say, I want to charge them or I don't want to charge them. The state's going to figure out whether or not they've got enough evidence in order for them to allocate their resources to it. But at the same time, if you're just creating this other barrier, this random barrier, when somebody might not have the emotional, physical, financial bandwidth to go through with this criminal case. So to be that witness to the state, they can and have the right and should have the right to pull out of that. So if they're not feeling safe enough to do that in the first place, we shouldn't block them from being able to have a safety of a protective order. And especially, and again, these statistics, you know, you read them and you memorize them and you think you got them right. But I believe the last I saw was you're 80% less likely to be re-victimized if you do have a protective order. So that's a real thing. And we can't continue to create barriers. I know our Black and White Ball, it's our annual big fundraising event because, yes, you know, we do need to pay for the work that we're doing, but we will never, ever charge a victim to get safety and become a survivor. But in that, we do honor former clients who want to tell their story because they want to make sure that other people in that same situation have access to us and can get the support they need. But, you know, the past 3 years, and you remember these stories, they're terrible.
Yeah.
One, the client had been left brutally beaten and he thought he had killed her and went to get the bleach to clean the crime scene. But all 3 of these victims, they ended up, their perpetrator deferred adjudication or some level of probation. But they've all said to us the justice that they received was through Texas Advocacy Project because they believe in that protective order. And it has been years, and those protective orders did create the safeties that they so desperately desired. Because each case took, 3 to 5 years. So now we're, 4 to 8 years into this.
Yeah. I have 2 things. So we know that 23% of the counties that we surveyed and the prosecutors that we surveyed require a police report. To mention again, that's not required by our state law. And so in counties, that's why it's important for us to do studies like this so our attorneys know, because that is a barrier. That's going to be a hurdle for a survivor. So when a survivor calls us and says, I tried to go to my local prosecutor's office, they told me I had to have a police report. Is that true? Do I really have to have one? Well, no. Those are cases that we can then help a survivor and navigate that system and take on and help them, assist them in getting that protective order, because that's not a requirement for the law.
Right.
So it's not going to be a requirement for our services either.
Well, it's interesting. I think that I also saw that there were some counties that if you had filed for a divorce already, you could not file for a protective order, which we know, unfortunately, in this
Policy.
what we do is that at the time you're trying to leave your batterer, the lethality can be higher, and that might be the first time that you need to apply for a protective order. So it is very important that we pay attention to these things. And there are these safeties and services out there. Let's dive into this third one, this third lethality prong that we're talking about, and that's firearms. Look, if you're not a bad person and you love hunting or you want to have that as a safety for your family, no issues with firearms. But there are definitely issues around firearms and protective orders and giving those firearms up if you are a subject of said protective order. Can we talk a little bit about what we learned with that?
Certainly. Both of you have mentioned evidence-based practices, and this is a place where we have really strong evidence to show that your lethality factor goes up by 500% if there's a firearm in the abusive situation. So there's really good public policy argument to limit abusers who are the subject of a protective order from having that firearm. That's a Texas law. It's also a federal law. So they mirror each other in that way, that if you're the subject of a protective order, if you're the respondent, there's been a finding that violence has occurred, then you shouldn't have a firearm. You're prohibited from having a firearm. And I think that's one of the reasons that they are so effective at keeping people safe. The issue that we've had is that there isn't a mechanism to have people surrender those firearms. It's kind of piecemeal. There's some counties where they have firearm surrender protocols and some counties where they don't. That's one of the great improvements Texas made. We made a law that every county needed to pull together a group and come up with a protocol. So I know, we all, Heather and I live locally, and we know that they're working on a really great protocol here. So I'm really optimistic about the safety that that's going to provide survivors.
And do I recall right from the study that it was about 25% of the counties do not have surrender protocols?
25% have protocols.
Oh,
yeah.
Well,
so
thank you for that distinction. That's a big difference.
There's a large portion of the state that do not have protocols into place. So, and this has been a part of firearm surrender has been a part of the statute, of the protective order statute, for as long as I can remember. And I've been doing this work for 20 years. So it might have been in there since the beginning. You can fact check me on that if you want to. But the protocol is the missing piece, right? And how do we get them?
Well, and I can understand there's a real life friction there, right? Mm-hmm. Because who's going to keep that firearm when you had to surrender it? Is it going to be insured? Will it be returned back to you after the protective order has expired? There are logistics involved there. But I think we're a pretty smart society. And clearly, Texas is the most Texasy of places ever. Yeah. And so I think that there are ways that we can get around these.
Yeah, there's incredible models that have been created all across the United States and here in Texas as well that have worked. They have to have a champion. Those communities have to have a champion that really gets behind it. That's like the number one thing. And when we live in a cycle where people get reelected or somebody new comes in, then those policies have to be adopted by our community so that we can see the life-saving effects that these things have on our communities. I mean, this is a community issue. This is a, huge issue in our communities with gun violence.
Well, everything that we're talking about, whether it's gun violence, whether it's strangulation, whether it's stalking, any abuse on a person is a big health issue for the entire community.
Yeah.
And that's why, again, it's important that we acknowledge that these abuses are happening. We acknowledge the power and control issues. We acknowledge the coerciveness. We look at the high lethality indicators, and we try to make sure that the laws that we have here in the state of Texas support victims to the best of their ability, which we are proving that they do. We just have to make sure that we can all get out there in the community and that we can have a coordinated community response. And that starts with being a good bystander that says, you know what, I'm noticing some things going on with you, and I see you, and I'm scared for you. And when you're ready, there are resources available to you, like Texas Advocacy Project and like all of the partners that we have throughout the state.
Yeah.
So, we're getting there, ladies. We're getting there. But we have to keep doing these surveys and keep understanding the landscape of what it is that we're living in and keep building the relationships with everybody out there.
Yeah, I think it's important to note that this report is not the end.
No.
It's the roadmap. We're moving forward.
Yeah. I think that we're going to be publishing this on a very regular basis going forward because, again, it was great for us internally to make sure that we understood what we had to do for the victims to become survivors, but sharing this with our colleagues and actually sharing it with the general population because, again, every piece of data that we can introduce into these discussions means that we're going to get that much more closer to having open conversations and perhaps having solutions and pathways towards.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like what you said about the community needing to acknowledge that this is a health issue for the greater community. And I think that really goes to the heart of this, that prosecutors have limited resources and they're having to make decisions about how they spend those resources.
Yeah.
And it unfortunately is very common for domestic violence to demand less of those resources because the community's not asking for it. They're thinking that'll never happen to me. I'm more worried about a stranger coming down the street or this random crime that I've heard about. And in reality, you are much more likely to experience this than any other type of offense. We know that 1 in 3 Texas women are going to experience domestic violence, and we should be demanding that law enforcement and prosecutors spend their resources accordingly. And I think if they did, we'd have very different responses to the survey.
Yeah. Well, and I think, too, when you layer in whether there's sexual assault or there's been stalking or there's, human trafficking, again, that client I spoke to this morning, there was trafficking involved in her case. And it just, all of this kind of locks in together. And yeah, we got to kind of peel it apart a little bit, make sure we're there for each other. Is there anything on the study that you wanted to visit a little bit longer about?
I think the only thing I'd like to point out, and it's right on the fold if you have our physical book, but it's question 11, if you're looking at this digitally, is the recency of violence.
Okay.
This was a lightning rod in the original 2013. And while we got some slightly better responses, when we asked prosecutors, do you require that there has been violence within the last 30 days if you're going to help someone apply for a protective order? And we had 27% said yes, they do require that.
Oh, my.
We had a big chunk of people say a more nuanced response. They didn't want to say no, but when you read the responses here, they were like, they gave good responses. They said, we always look at the totality of the circumstances, or, we want to look for recency, but if there isn't, we wouldn't send someone away. Those nuanced responses are, for the most part, seem acceptable. But there is no evidence to show that recency of violence is any indicator of a higher lethality. There isn't. You've mentioned what we have, that we've got examples if there's been strangulation, stalking, presence of a firearm. There's several others. If you want to look at Jacqueline Campbell's danger assessment, they're all there. But this recency is not one of them. And the more and more we learn about coercive control, which is not going to meet the current Texas definition of family violence, I actually think you could be in more danger if you're experiencing that coercive control, and there could have been no physical violence for years. And I think you could be in greater danger. And I think that I'd be really encouraged if we could get some research to help support that, and we could bring that research forward to our legislature. But right now, our law doesn't require recency. We have great law.
We do.
But yet we still have a lot of prosecutors' offices that aren't following the letter of that law.
That are tied a little bit on that. It's interesting, on the strangulation conversation that we had earlier, they said that just one strangulation is enough to say, I can get you this close to death and will. So That could happen once, and 10 years from now, you're still in this abusive relationship and it never happened again.
Yeah.
But it doesn't mean that you don't know for a fact you could be murdered at any moment.
And the fact that you're now 10 years later going to call for help, going to ask the police for help, ask for a protective order, that's what's increasing the danger.
Mm-hmm.
So I think if they wanted to have a recency requirement, they could say recency of requesting help. There's science for that, but there's no recency of violence in the literature, in the research. This is costing people's lives.
Yeah. So moving forward, we're going to continue with this publication, and we're going to be sharing it, and we're going to hope that we're going to see a lot of different tweaks to the laws when needed. We're going to see a lot of strengths kind of come up out of this. We're going to see the trends going towards being more victim-centric, right? And that the enforcement, that key part of it, that enforcement is there. So next steps, right? I think we have a town hall. Ladies, do you want to tell a little bit about the town hall?
Sure. We have a town hall that's coming up in a couple of weeks. You can go to our website. You can go to our social media pages to learn more about how to register for our town hall, where we'll be talking more in depth about our protective order study. We'll give more details and data, and you'll have access to that study as well that you can go and peruse and read if you'd like at your leisure. And then we will be presenting at conferences as well.
Fantastic. I love it. And again, if you're just now tuning in, this is Texas Advocacy Project. I've got our Chief Legal Officer, Bronwyn Blake. I've got Amanda Elkanik-Oder, our Chief Advocacy and Education Officer with me, and I am the Chief Executive Officer. But importantly, before you go, if you know somebody who is being harmed, right? I see you. I believe you. I'm scared for you. And when you are ready, because it's about the empowerment so that somebody can become a survivor, when you are ready, we have a resource for you. Texas Advocacy Project, 1-800-374-HOPE, or go to the web at www.texasadvocacyproject.org. Fill out an online application if you want to figure out what your legal rights are.